My name is Margaret Blake. I'm 64 years old, and I've run my own little flower shop in Oregon for over 30 years. I was always there for my family, supporting them through every chapter of their lives. So, when my granddaughter Jessica invited me to her wedding, I prepared for the day with care and excitement, my heart full of pride. But the day before the ceremony, I stumbled across a conversation I was never meant to hear. Jessica had instructed the photographer not to take any pictures of me because I would ruin the aesthetic. That's when I made my move, and I made sure they would never forget that day. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Margaret Blake, and at 64 years old, I considered myself a woman who had built a good, honest life. I owned a small flower shop on the outskirts of Eugene, Oregon, a place that had been both my livelihood and my sanctuary for more than 3 decades. Over the years, my shop had seen countless weddings, birthdays, funerals, and anniversaries. Through every season, every change, I had remained steady, like the old oak tree in the park near my childhood home. When my granddaughter Jessica announced she was getting married, my heart swelled with pride. It felt like one of those full circle moments you read about in novels, the kind where life rewards you quietly for all the years of hard work, sacrifice, and love you had poured into the world. Jessica had always been a bright, headstrong girl, and even as she grew older and the distance between us widened, I still saw flashes of the little girl who used to sit at the counter in my flower shop, weaving tiny crowns out of baby's breath and laughing at my terrible jokes. The invitation to her wedding arrived on a Thursday afternoon, tucked neatly into my mailbox between a water bill and a flyer for a new grocery store. I opened it carefully, tracing the embossed letters with my fingertips, savoring the feeling. They had chosen a beautiful vineyard venue just outside of town, surrounded by rolling hills and ancient trees. I could already imagine the photographs, the laughter, the soft clink of glasses under a wide open sky. I wanted to look my best for Jessica's day. It wasn't about vanity, it was about respect, about showing up fully for the people you loved. I set aside a portion of my savings and drove into the city one Saturday to find a dress. The boutique was bright and airy, filled with the scent of new fabric and expensive perfume. I wandered through the racks, running my hands over silk and chiffon, feeling like an outsider in a world that had moved on without me. Eventually, I found it, a soft blue dress with delicate lace at the sleeves and a gentle flare at the skirt. It wasn't flashy or trendy. It was simply beautiful, the kind of dress that felt like an extension of who I was rather than a costume for someone else's fantasy. I paired it with low-heeled shoes, comfortable enough to wear all day, and a simple pearl necklace that had belonged to my mother. Back at home, I carefully hung the dress in my closet, smiling to myself each time I glanced at it. It represented more than just clothing. It was a symbol of my hope, my excitement, my belief that there was still a place for me in the family's story. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, I threw myself into preparations. I offered to help with the floral arrangements, suggesting seasonal blooms that would last through the long afternoon and into the evening. Jessica thanked me politely, but told me they had already hired a professional florist. I told myself it was fine, that she was just busy, that things were different now. I bought a beautiful card and spent an evening writing a letter to Jessica inside it, a letter full of memories, wishes, and the kind of advice only age can give. I wrapped her wedding gift with trembling hands, a vintage quilt I had spent 2 years sewing, each square a different piece of fabric collected from family dresses, shirts, and blankets. I wanted her to have something tangible, something stitched with the invisible thread of our shared history. Every corner of my house became a staging area for the wedding. I polished my good shoes, pressed my dress, chose a simple clutch to carry. I even scheduled a haircut, something I rarely did these days, sitting patiently in the chair as the stylist shaped my silver hair into soft waves. I wanted to feel like the best version of myself when I stood among them. I imagined the day in vivid detail. Jessica walking down the aisle, radiant and beaming, family photos under the heavy branches of the oak trees, laughter over toasts and cake, maybe even a moment, just a small one, where she would catch my eye across the room and smile the way she used to when she was a little girl. A smile that said, "I see you. I know you love me." I wanted so badly to believe in that moment. I wanted to believe that despite the busy schedules, the years spent growing apart, the changes life inevitably brought, the core of our bond remained unbroken. In quiet moments, I allowed myself to dream of how proud Frank would have been if he were still alive to see his granddaughter marry. I pictured him standing beside me, his hand warm and solid against my back, his voice whispering something irreverent and funny to make me laugh when the emotions became too much. I let those dreams carry me through the occasional prickle of doubt when text messages went unanswered, when plans seemed to be made without consulting me, when decisions about seating charts and playlists floated past me like conversations held behind closed doors. I told myself not to take it personally. Young people had so much on their minds. It didn't mean they loved me any less. Still, somewhere deep inside, a small, cautious part of me, the part that had weathered heartbreak and disappointment too many times, began to whisper warnings I wasn't ready to hear. I silenced it. I focused on the preparations. I held tight to the vision of a day filled with love and gratitude, a day where I could stand proudly among my family, not as a relic of the past, but as a living part of their future. I thought if I gave enough, waited patiently enough, loved deeply enough, it would be enough. I didn't yet know how wrong I was, but soon I would. The week before the wedding began with a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the weather. At first, it was small things, the kinds of things easy to brush off if you wanted badly enough to believe everything was fine. And I did want to believe that, more than anything. The first uneasy moment came when I called Jessica to confirm the time I should arrive at the venue. I had thought we would ride over together, maybe share a few quiet moments before the rush of the day began. It had seemed natural, something that would have made her feel supported, grounded. But when she answered the phone, her voice was tight, hurried, the way people sound when they're reading emails or half listening to a conversation. She told me that it would probably be better if I came separately. The girls would be getting ready together, she said, and there wasn't really room for extra people in the bridal suite. I could hear other voices in the background, young, bright, laughing. Jessica sounded distracted, almost annoyed. I told myself she was simply overwhelmed, that weddings were chaotic by nature, that she wasn't thinking about how her words might land. Still, when I hung up, a knot began to form in my stomach. A few days later, I dropped by the flower shop where Jessica had ordered her wedding arrangements. I thought it would be nice to see them, maybe even offer some small help. Flowers had been my life's work after all, and I knew how to handle them with a tenderness and care few others could match. I wasn't trying to interfere. I just wanted to feel involved, connected to the day in a way that wasn't just as another face in the crowd. The florist, a young woman barely older than Jessica, smiled politely when I introduced myself. But when I mentioned Jessica's name, she hesitated, her smile faltering for the briefest moment before she smoothed it back into place. She told me everything was under control, that Jessica had been very specific about what she wanted. There was no need for any changes, no need for anyone else to assist. The way she said anyone else stuck with me. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't even intentionally unkind. But it carried a certain finality, a subtle closing of the door. I left the shop feeling smaller than when I had entered, the knot in my stomach pulling tighter. I tried to dismiss it all as nerves. I kept telling myself that young brides had a vision, that it was their day, that I was being overly sensitive. It was easy to feed myself that story during the daylight hours, when the sun was bright and my shop kept me busy arranging bouquets and filling orders for Valentine's Day. But at night, when the house grew silent and the dark pressed in against the windows, my doubts crept closer, whispering the things I didn't want to hear. Then came the seating chart. Susan, Jessica's mother, called me late one evening, her voice carefully cheerful. She explained that there had been a few changes, last-minute adjustments to accommodate some of the groom's extended family who had decided to attend after all. I would be seated at a table toward the back, near the doors to the patio. It wasn't said with malice. It was said with logistics, with the casual efficiency of someone rearranging furniture to better suit a party layout. I nodded and agreed, thanking her for letting me know. After all, I told myself, it didn't matter where I sat. What mattered was being there, being part of the day, seeing Jessica walk down the aisle toward a new life. But inside, something wilted. Once upon a time, I would have been at the family table. Once, I would have been close enough to catch her eye and share a smile during the toasts. Now, I would be a spectator at the edges of her celebration, tucked away politely like a necessary obligation. The worst of it came 2 days before the wedding, during the final walkthrough at the vineyard. I had gone at Susan's invitation, thinking I might help with small details, organizing programs, adjusting centerpieces, offering an extra pair of hands wherever needed. But as I wandered the grounds, I noticed how carefully I was being excluded. Jessica huddled with her bridesmaids, her voice low and animated, while Susan and the wedding planner conferred over schedules and deliveries. Every time I approached a group, conversation shifted or trailed off altogether. At one point, I heard my name. I turned a corner and paused, unseen, as Jessica spoke to the photographer, a young man with a beard and a heavy camera slung around his neck. "I don't want any photos with her," she said, her voice low but firm. "I know she means well, but she just doesn't fit the aesthetic. I want everything to look modern, clean, young." The photographer hesitated, glancing around as if unsure how to respond. Jessica laughed a little, brushing it off with a wave of her hand. "Just make sure she's not in the main shots. Candid stuff is fine, but nothing formal." I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, the edges of the world blurring slightly as I fought the urge to cry. In that moment, it was as if every careful hope, every dream of being part of her day, shattered into tiny glittering pieces at my feet. I wasn't family, I was furniture, a background piece to be arranged or erased as they saw fit. The ride home that evening felt longer than it was. I drove through the winding country roads in silence, the radio turned off, the only sound the steady hum of the tires against the pavement and the occasional creak of the old car as it rolled over bumps. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sky was a deep, endless blue, the stars beginning to blink awake. I sat in the car for a long time before going inside, my hands resting limply on the steering wheel. Something inside me had shifted. The signs had been there all along. I had just refused to see them. Until now. The morning after the walkthrough, I woke earlier than usual, long before the winter sun climbed over the hills. The house was wrapped in darkness and silence, but my mind churned with restless energy. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea cooling in my hands, staring out the window into the gray blur of dawn, feeling a hollowness growing inside me that I could no longer ignore. The words I had overheard the day before echoed in my ears with cruel clarity. She doesn't fit the aesthetic. I had replayed that sentence all night, dissecting it, trying to soften it, trying to make it hurt less. But no matter how many ways I turned it over, the meaning remained the same. I wasn't wanted. I wasn't seen as part of the beautiful narrative Jessica was trying to craft for her wedding day. I was an eyesore to be edited out, a relic of a past she had no intention of showcasing. I thought about all the little signs I had ignored leading up to that moment, the unanswered texts, the short phone calls, the polite but distant smiles. It was all there, woven through our interactions like fine cracks in glass, waiting for the right amount of pressure to shatter everything. I told myself it shouldn't matter. It was her day after all, her celebration, not mine. But no matter how I tried to rationalize it, the hurt dug deep, burrowing into places I thought I had long ago steeled against such wounds. I spent that morning moving through my house like a ghost, cleaning shelves that didn't need cleaning, refolding laundry that was already neatly stacked, rearranging the flowers in their vases, even though they were perfectly fine. Busy hands to quiet a busy mind. But the truth clung to me, no matter how much I scrubbed or dusted or sorted. At noon, Susan called. Her voice was breezy, almost chipper, as she ran through last-minute details, parking instructions, the seating chart one more time, the timing of the ceremony. I listened carefully, responding when necessary, all the while feeling a growing sense of detachment, as if I were floating just above the conversation, watching myself nod and murmur agreements. She didn't mention the photos. She didn't mention anything about my role beyond the bare minimum. When she hung up, promising to see me tomorrow at the vineyard, I sat staring at the phone for a long time, the dial tone humming in my ear like a low, persistent warning. I realized then that I had a choice to make. I could go through with it. I could dress carefully, drive to the venue, sit quietly in my assigned seat near the patio, and smile for candid snapshots if anyone happened to point a lens in my direction. I could play my part with grace, pretend that the slight didn't burn, that the exclusion didn't wound, that the erasure of my presence wasn't a calculated decision, or I could do something else, something that would not be loud or vengeful, but deliberate, something that would reclaim a piece of the dignity they thought they could strip away so easily. I stood and crossed the room to the closet where my dress hung, carefully pressed, waiting. I ran my fingers over the soft lace at the sleeves, feeling a tightness in my chest. It wasn't just a dress anymore. It was a symbol of everything I had hoped to be part of, every memory I had clung to, every ounce of love I had poured into that child from the moment she had first been placed in my arms. And it wasn't enough. I left the dress hanging in the closet and walked back to the kitchen. I sat down again, this time with a pen and notepad in front of me. I began making a list, small and meticulous, outlining what needed to be done before the wedding day arrived. At the top of that list was the photographer. I remembered clearly that I had contributed to many of the wedding expenses. It was something I had offered months ago, wanting to help ease the financial burden, wanting to be a part of the joy. Among those contributions had been a significant payment toward the photographer's retainer. It gave me leverage I hadn't considered before, a quiet, simple option to remove myself from the narrative on my own terms. I didn't make any decisions in haste. I spent the afternoon thinking it through, weighing the consequences, preparing myself for the inevitable fallout. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about hurting Jessica the way she had hurt me. It was about stepping out of a picture where I had been made to feel invisible, about refusing to let them polish me out quietly while still benefiting from my support. By sunset, the decision was made. The sky turned a dusky lavender, the last light catching on the bare branches outside. I watched it fade, feeling a strange, painful peace settle over me. The kind of peace that comes when you finally stop clinging to the way things were supposed to be and accept them for what they are. I made myself a simple dinner, soup and a slice of buttered bread, and ate in silence. The house seemed to exhale around me as if it too had been holding its breath, waiting for me to see the truth. When night fell, I locked the doors, turned out the lights, and stood for a moment at the foot of the stairs, staring into the darkened rooms filled with so many echoes of a life spent loving people who no longer remembered how to love me back. I wasn't angry. I was simply done pretending. Tomorrow would come with or without their approval, and I would meet it standing tall, no matter what storm it carried. The morning of the wedding dawned gray and misty, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and cold promise. I woke before my alarm, though I had barely slept. The house was silent except for the low hum of the heater kicking on, trying to chase away the chill that had crept in overnight. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long moment, feeling the weight of the day settle onto my shoulders like a too heavy coat. I moved slowly through my morning routine, not because of hesitation, but because I wanted to be deliberate with each step. I brewed a pot of coffee, poured it into my favorite chipped mug, and stood by the kitchen window, watching the world outside dissolve into a pale, shifting fog. In another life, I would have been bustling with excitement, checking my reflection in the mirror, tying and retying the ribbon on the gift, practicing the speech I might give when someone inevitably asked me to say a few words. But that world no longer existed. Instead, I savored the quiet. I breathed deeply, letting the cold air from the slightly open window fill my lungs. I needed the sharpness of it, the reminder that I was still here, still capable of choosing my own path, even if it diverged from the one everyone else assumed I would walk. I took my time dressing, choosing a simple outfit, comfortable slacks and a soft sweater, not the blue dress I had so lovingly prepared. It hung in the closet, untouched, a silent witness to all the hope I had packed into it. I didn't have the heart to wear it. Not for this. Once I was ready, I pulled out the folder where I had neatly filed all the receipts and agreements for the wedding contributions. I found the photographer's contract without difficulty, my handwriting penciled neatly in the margins from when Susan and I had reviewed the paperwork months ago. My signature was there, clear as day, right beside the deposit amount I had paid personally. I dialed the photographer's number with steady hands. He answered after a few rings, his voice warm and professional. I introduced myself and explained as calmly and politely as if I were canceling a dental appointment that I would be retracting my portion of the payment and, therefore, my approval of the contract. I told him I understood if that meant he needed to cancel his services entirely. He hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, but after a few minutes of discussion, he agreed. Without my contribution, the event no longer met the conditions outlined in the agreement. The photographer would not be coming. I thanked him, wished him well, and ended the call. The finality of it settled around me like the click of a door closing. There were no fireworks, no righteous anger, no sense of vindictive satisfaction, just a quiet, steady certainty that I had done the only thing left to do. I knew there would be consequences. I knew that when they realized what had happened, there would be confusion, then outrage, maybe even hurt. I had spent my life trying to avoid those reactions, smoothing over conflicts, swallowing my own feelings to preserve peace. But peace built on erasure was no peace at all. It was a slow suffocation. This time, I had chosen a different way. I spent the rest of the morning tending to small things around the house, dusting the shelves, watering the plants, changing the linens on the bed. Each task was a thread weaving me back into my own life, a reminder that there were still things within my control, still corners of the world where I could exist fully without apology. I made myself lunch and sat down at the kitchen table, eating slowly, savoring each bite. Outside, the fog had lifted slightly, revealing the bare trees lining the street, their branches dark and stark against the winter sky. The world looked raw, stripped of pretense, honest in a way that resonated deep inside me. I thought about Jessica, about the little girl she had once been, with scraped knees and a wild laugh that could fill a room. I mourned the loss of that connection, mourned the distance that had grown between us until it became a chasm neither of us had the courage or the will to cross. But I also understood something now that I hadn't understood before. Love was not a chain. It was not a duty that demanded silence in the face of humiliation. Real love, true love, required space, respect, the willingness to see and be seen without conditions. And if that kind of love no longer existed between us, then clinging to its ghost would only cheapen what had once been real. By the time the hour of the ceremony arrived, I was sitting by the fireplace with a book open on my lap, the warmth of the flames brushing against my skin. I didn't feel sadness, not in the way I had feared. I felt relief, relief that I had honored myself, that I had refused to stand quietly in a corner and pretend I was invisible just to make someone else's story look prettier. The house grew darker as the afternoon faded into evening. I made tea and wrapped myself in a thick knitted throw, letting the softness surround me. Somewhere, not far from where I sat, the wedding was happening. Vows were being exchanged, champagne was being poured, laughter was ringing out across the vineyard, and there would be no official photographs to commemorate it. No carefully curated album to frame a version of the day that left me edited out. I had given them the freedom they sought, the freedom to craft their perfect image, and I had given myself the gift of stepping away before they could erase me entirely. It wasn't an act of war, it was an act of survival. And in the quiet that filled my home, in the steady rhythm of my own breathing, I realized it was the right choice. The wedding ceremony took place under a pale winter sky, the kind of muted blue that looks delicate and thin, as if it might crack open under the weight of too much expectation. I stayed home, tucked away in the quiet safety of my living room, sipping tea and reading a worn novel whose ending I had memorized long ago. Outside, the world moved as it always did, oblivious to the storms that raged quietly inside small houses like mine. I imagined the guests arriving at the vineyard, pulling their coats tighter around their bodies against the chill, chatting politely as they made their way toward the ceremony space. I imagined Jessica standing with her bridesmaids, the photographer's absence slowly dawning on them like a cloud crossing the sun. A minor inconvenience at first, a shrug, maybe even a laugh. These things happen. But as the minutes ticked by and no replacement arrived, I knew the reality would begin to sink in. There would be no formal portraits, no first look captured forever, no candid smiles during the toasts, no proud parents posing with the newlyweds under the old oak tree. There would be no wedding album to gather dust on a coffee table, no glossy prints to frame and hang on the walls. The story they had wanted to tell would remain unfinished, scattered in fragments among guests' cell phones and half-remembered conversations. It was a move made without announcement, without confrontation, without the satisfaction of seeing their immediate reactions. I had no interest in watching the fallout unfold. My point had never been to create a scene, to pull attention away from Jessica on her day. I wanted only to reclaim the dignity that had been quietly, systematically stripped from me in the months leading up to this moment. By the time Susan called, the sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor of my kitchen. I let the call ring 3 times before answering, keeping my voice steady and warm, as if nothing were amiss. She didn't even say hello at first. I could hear the strain in her breathing, the sharp edge to her voice as she demanded to know if I had anything to do with the photographer canceling. I listened patiently as she tried to mask her anger with wounded confusion, painting herself and Jessica as victims of an unfortunate misunderstanding. I didn't deny anything. I didn't offer explanations. I simply said that I had exercised my rights according to the contract I had signed, and that I wished them well. The silence that followed was thick, humming with all the things she wanted to scream but knew better than to voice. I waited. When she finally spoke again, her voice was brittle with barely restrained fury, thanking me for making things even harder on a day that was supposed to be perfect. I told her gently that perfection built on exclusion and pretense was a fragile thing. She hung up without another word. I set the phone down carefully and sat for a long time, staring out the window as the first stars began to pierce the gathering darkness. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt something far quieter, deeper, the heavy ache of finality, of understanding that the line I had drawn would not easily be erased. Across town, they were surely scrambling now, piecing together impromptu photos with cell phones, trying to capture a day that had been so meticulously planned, so carefully curated, but no amount of filters or editing would change the truth. The cracks in their perfect facade were permanent now, visible to anyone who cared enough to look closely. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had wanted a seamless memory, a collection of images unmarred by anything they deemed imperfect. Instead, they would remember a day marked by absence. The absence of a professional photographer, yes, but also the absence of something more profound. The absence of genuine, unconditional love that doesn't measure worth by appearances or convenience. I moved through the rest of the evening slowly, tending to my small routines. I watered the houseplants, folded a load of laundry, fed the cat who wove himself between my legs, purring insistently. Each simple act grounded me, tethered me to the life I had rebuilt piece by piece. Later, as I sat by the fire, the flickering light casting soft shadows across the room, I thought about all the times I had swallowed hurt for the sake of peace, all the times I had smiled through insult and exclusion because I believed it was what love demanded. No more. My move had been quiet. It had been decisive, and though it had cost me something, an invisible thread of connection, a sliver of belonging, I knew it had preserved something far more important: my self-respect, my voice, my place in the world, no longer dictated by the shallow standards of those who could not see my value unless it was reflected in a perfect picture. I closed my eyes and let the warmth of the fire seep into my bones, feeling a peace deeper than any apology could have offered. They had made their choices, and I had made mine. Tomorrow would come, and with it, the first steps into a life no longer spent asking for space in stories I had outgrown. The days after the wedding unfolded with a strange, heavy quietness that settled over my life like a thick blanket. It was not the peaceful, satisfying kind of silence that follows the completion of something meaningful. It was a colder, denser kind of quiet, like the emptiness that comes after a storm passes and leaves behind nothing but broken branches and muddy ground. At first, there were no calls, no texts, no hurried explanations or clumsy apologies, just silence, pure and unbroken. I found it almost astonishing how quickly a family that once demanded my attention and affection could erase my presence when it became inconvenient. It was as if my absence at the wedding had confirmed some narrative they had been writing in secret for months, a story where I had faded quietly into the background, too troublesome to include, too stubborn to control. I moved through my days deliberately, keeping to the rhythms that had always anchored me. I opened my flower shop each morning, greeted the regulars with smiles that did not quite reach my eyes, arranged bouquets with a tenderness that I no longer offered so freely to people outside these walls. I swept the floors, watered the plants, took inventory, and closed up at night with a tired ache in my bones that had nothing to do with physical labor. Every now and then, the urge to reach out would flicker inside me like a match struck in the dark. I would picture picking up the phone, dialing Susan's number, demanding answers, demanding acknowledgement. I would imagine writing a letter to Jessica, explaining everything she had made me feel, laying bare the depth of the hurt she had inflicted without ever truly looking me in the eyes. But each time, the flame of that impulse died as quickly as it had been lit. There was nothing to say that hadn't already been said in actions. Words were useless in the face of deliberate exclusion. The silence itself was the answer. On Sunday, I attended church as I always did. The sanctuary felt colder than usual, the winter light slanting through the stained glass windows in pale, watery beams. People came up to me, asking how the wedding had been, expecting stories of laughter, of joy, of celebration. I smiled politely and told them it had been lovely, steering the conversation away from specifics. There was no malice in their questions, only the innocent expectation that such a milestone would be a source of pride, a shared community joy. I didn't have the heart to shatter their illusions. Later that afternoon, while folding laundry, I found myself staring at the neatly pressed blue dress still hanging untouched in my closet. I ran my fingers over the fabric, feeling the soft weave beneath my skin, remembering the hope that had filled me when I first bought it. I knew then that I would never wear it, not because it was tainted or because I was ashamed, but because it belonged to a version of me that had finally been laid to rest. The silence stretched on. No thank you note arrived in the mail. No follow-up invitation for coffee or lunch. No small gesture to acknowledge that I had once been important, once been loved, once been a fixture in lives that now moved on without me. Instead, life outside my small house carried on in the same thoughtless rush it always had. Cars still drove past on the street. Children still played under the brittle winter trees. Neighbors still waved as they walked their dogs in the fading afternoon light. The world did not pause to mourn the quiet fracture of a family, nor did it notice when one heart grew a little heavier, a little more careful with its affections. At night, when the loneliness pressed hardest against my chest, I would sit by the fire and remind myself that solitude was not the same as abandonment. I had chosen to step back, to draw a line, to refuse a seat at a table where my worth was measured in appearances and utility, rather than in the messy, enduring love that should have defined a family. The silence was not punishment. It was space, space to grieve, to heal, to rebuild, space to remember that my value had never depended on anyone else's recognition. I began to fill my days with small, stubborn acts of self-respect. I baked bread and shared it with my elderly neighbor. I spent long afternoons organizing old photographs into albums, reclaiming my history one snapshot at a time. I read poetry aloud to the walls of my living room, letting the words wrap around me like armor. Each act, though small, felt like a stone placed carefully at the foundation of something new. Not a new life exactly, but a new understanding of the one I had already built. A life not defined by whether I appeared in someone else's wedding album. A life not diminished by absence from someone else's curated memories. A life that was whole, even if it was quiet, especially because it was quiet. The silence would not break me. It would become my sanctuary. The weeks that followed unspooled slowly, each day stretching out in long, quiet hours, filled with ordinary tasks and unexpected revelations. In the absence of noise, in the absence of forced conversations and hollow niceties, I began to see things with a clarity that had eluded me for years. The silence had stripped away all the layers of polite pretense, and what remained was the raw, undeniable truth of who we all had become. It started with small moments, things I might have once overlooked or excused. A package arrived for me one afternoon, left neatly on the porch. It was from Susan and Jessica, a belated gesture, a box filled with leftover wedding favors, a small card tucked on top with pre-printed words thanking me for being part of our special day. There was no personal note, no acknowledgement of my absence, no mention of the photographs that had never been taken. The card was unsigned. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, the cold air creeping around my ankles, staring down at the box. It wasn't a gesture of love. It was an obligation, a final attempt to paper over the cracks without addressing what had caused them. I placed the box on a shelf in the garage without opening it. Later that week, I heard from an old family friend who had attended the wedding. She spoke carefully, her voice tiptoeing around the subject, but her words painted a vivid picture. She told me about the confusion when the photographer failed to arrive, about the scramble to find someone among the guests to take pictures with their phones. She mentioned how the atmosphere shifted after that, how tension wove itself through the rest of the evening like a thread pulling too tightly through worn fabric. No one spoke my name. No one asked where I was. I was not missed. I was not mourned. I simply wasn't. It was a strange kind of grief, realizing that the people you had poured your heart into were perfectly capable of moving forward without looking back. It was not the grief of loss, because they were still alive, still living just a few miles away. It was the grief of irrelevance, the slow erosion of meaning, the undeniable truth that your place in their world had been reduced to something they could discard without ceremony. I found myself revisiting old memories with new eyes. I thought about birthday parties where I had spent hours baking cakes and decorating the house, only to be thanked with a distracted hug. I remembered Christmas mornings where the gifts I had chosen so carefully were pushed aside for flashier packages. I recalled phone calls that grew shorter and more infrequent, family dinners where my stories were met with polite smiles, but little real interest. The signs had always been there. I had simply chosen not to see them, because seeing them meant admitting that love, at least the kind I had given so freely, was not always enough to bridge the distance created by ambition, pride, or indifference. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky turned a soft, bruised purple, I sat by the fire and wrote a letter, not to Susan or Jessica, but to myself. A letter of acknowledgement, of mourning, of release. I wrote about the woman I had been, the woman who had given and given, believing that love meant sacrifice without expectation. I wrote about the woman I was becoming, the woman who understood that love must be mutual, that respect must be earned, that absence could be a form of self-preservation. I folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer, not because I needed to revisit it, but because the act of writing it had been enough. The faces of my family, once so familiar and dear, had shifted into something new. They were no longer the untouchable heroes of my memory. They were flawed, complicated, capable of both love and cruelty, tenderness and carelessness. They were human, and so was I. In recognizing their true faces, I was forced to recognize my own. I was not just a victim of their thoughtlessness. I was also complicit in my own pain, clinging to outdated expectations, refusing to see what was right in front of me because it was easier to hold on to hope than to face reality. But there was freedom in that realization, freedom to stop chasing approval, freedom to stop molding myself into something easier for them to love, freedom to exist without apology, without explanation. As winter deepened and the days grew shorter, I found a strange, quiet peace settling over me. I no longer waited for the phone to ring. I no longer checked the mailbox with a flutter of hope in my chest. I no longer replayed old conversations, searching for hidden meanings or overlooked kindnesses. I accepted the silence. I embraced the space it left behind. And in that space, I began to rebuild, not the relationships that had fractured beyond repair, but the foundation of my own heart, stronger and more honest than it had been in years. Spring crept in slowly, almost shyly, as if unsure whether it was welcome after the harsh, lingering winter. I watched the world outside my windows begin to soften, the brittle trees budding with hesitant green, the earth releasing its damp, rich scent into the air. Life, it seemed, was determined to renew itself whether anyone noticed or not. Inside my little house, the changes were more deliberate, more personal. They were not heralded by bright flowers or warm breezes, but by small, stubborn acts of self-respect that accumulated quietly, one decision at a time. It began with a new habit. Every morning, before touching my phone or opening the shop, I sat by the window with a cup of coffee and wrote a single sentence in a notebook. Some days it was a memory that made me smile. Some days it was an acknowledgement of something I had survived. Some days it was simply a promise to myself to remain true to who I was becoming. The sentences formed a kind of trail behind me, proof that I was moving forward even when it felt like I was standing still. I understood now that healing was not about pretending the hurt had never happened. It was about building a life that honored the lessons learned from that pain without allowing it to define me. And at the center of that new life was something I had never fully given myself before, a boundary. My new boundary was not a wall. It was not a fortress built to keep everyone out. It was a simple, quiet line drawn with steady hands. A line that said, "Here is where I end and you begin. Here is what I will allow. Here is what I will no longer carry for you." Susan and Jessica remained distant, reaching out only sporadically with empty messages that felt more like obligations than genuine attempts at connection. I responded politely but briefly, no longer twisting myself into knots trying to sustain conversations that had nowhere to go. I refused invitations that felt performative, that seemed to be offered more out of duty than desire. I declined to participate in the delicate dance of pretending everything was fine when the foundation beneath us had long since crumbled. For the first time, I no longer felt guilty for saying no. I no longer felt responsible for fixing what I did not break. There was a profound kind of peace in that. I poured my energy into things that nourished me instead. I expanded the flower shop, adding a small reading corner filled with secondhand books and cozy chairs. I hosted Sunday afternoon gatherings for the few friends who had remained steadfast through every storm. We shared tea and laughter and quiet stories, weaving a new kind of family from the threads of mutual respect and genuine affection. I planted a vegetable garden in the backyard, something I had always wanted to do but had never found the time for. As I knelt in the dirt, my hands stained with soil, I thought about how growth often looked like chaos before it became beauty. The garden was messy at first, unruly and unpredictable, but over time, it flourished. Just like me, there were hard days, of course, days when the old sadness crept back in, whispering that maybe I had given up too soon, that maybe if I had just been a little more patient, a little more forgiving, things would have turned out differently. On those days, I sat with the sadness, acknowledged it, and then gently reminded myself that protecting my heart was not an act of betrayal. It was an act of love. Love for the woman who had spent too many years believing she had to earn her place by shrinking herself. As spring unfurled fully around me, I realized that my new boundary was not just about keeping certain people at a distance. It was about inviting the right ones closer. It was about creating a life where I could exist without apology, where I could trust that the people in my world valued me not for what I could give them, but simply for who I was. I no longer needed to appear in anyone's photographs to prove that I mattered. I no longer needed to be included in someone else's story to validate my own. My story was enough. My voice was enough. My presence, even in its quietest, most unseen moments, was enough. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the hills and the garden buzzed softly with life, I stood barefoot in the grass, feeling the earth solid and warm beneath my feet. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, letting the cool air fill my lungs, letting the peace of the moment settle into my bones. I had lost something, yes, but I had gained something greater. I had gained myself. And in that simple, undeniable truth, I found a joy deeper and more enduring than any fleeting approval could ever offer. This was my new boundary. This was my new beginning.